Floats and positioning. So far we talked about HTML and CSS. HTML being content and CSS being presentation of the content. Now when we say floats and positioning, we're basically talking about laying out the nicely presented, nicely styled content in a layout. So we use floats and we use positioning, which are CSS properties, in order to create a layout for a web page. Floats. A float is a block element that is shifted to the left or the right. Let's look at this example. We have a div whose ID is box. This is the syntax in CSS. It is 100 pixels wide and 230 pixels high, and it has this fuchsia background color. On a black background, if the body were black, this is how the div would look. Okay? Now, if we gave this div pound box an additional property called float right, what would happen? The div would float to the right side of the screen. Simple. An element with a float applied to it gets plucked out of the flow. What does that mean? If we have these three divs in order in the CSS, a div whose ID is top box, another div whose ID is middle box, a third whose ID is bottom box, one is fuchsia, the other is blue, and the last one is light gray. Let's see how this looks, okay? This is how the divs obviously go under each other. That's because they're block elements. They don't leave a space in between, so they go right under each other. One is fuchsia, blue, and gray. Let's see what gets plucked out of the flow means. When an element is plucked out of the flow, it means that its order in HTML has changed. So in other words, if we have an HTML file in which the div top box is typed first, after it the div middle box is typed, which means div space ID equals middle box within quotation marks and so on, and then the div bottom box is typed third, the element that has a float will be plucked out of the flow. So in other words, if div top box has a float, then it's plucked out of the flow of the HTML flow. It is no longer number one. Div middle box becomes number one, and div bottom box becomes number two. And so div top box now resides in the float world, if you want to think of it that way. Let's look at what happens when we apply float right to div top box. So the fuchsia box. We expect it to go to the right side of the screen, right? That's exactly what happens. It goes to the right side of the screen. But what else happens? The blue box and the gray box take its place. That's because div top box was plucked out of the flow. So it is no longer number one in the order of elements in HTML. Now the blue one becomes number one, and the gray one becomes number two. So this is the result. Div top box floats to the right, but since it is plucked out of the flow, there is no empty space here with its height. Instead, the blue and the gray take its place. That's what being plucked out of the flow means. A float can be right or it can be left. Applying clear to an element is telling it to clear the float of the first element before it that has a float. To clear means to go under or to avoid the obstacle. Let's look at this example. So if we're looking at the same example as the previous slide, but we apply a clear right to the blue box, to div pound middle box, which is blue, what are we telling it? We are basically telling it, blue box, go under, clear, go under the first element before you, which is the fuchsia box, which is div top box, go under the first element before you that has a float. Obviously, since the top box has a float right, clear should say clear right. And so applying clear right to div middle box will push div middle box and div bottom box down right under the height of the fuchsia box. So if the fuchsia box were 90 pixels high, that's how much the blue box and the gray box went down on the screen. Clear can be right, it can be left, and it can be both. So here, if the float is right, we can say clear right, or we can say clear both. If we say clear left, nothing will work because the element before the blue box indeed has a float, but it is a right float. It's not a left float. Applying float left or right to items in a list changes them from a vertical to a horizontal flow. You remember this example from the CSS lesson. We have an unordered list that contains 5 list items: about us, product, services, research, contact us. So we're pretending this is a navigation. And if we style this navigation in CSS with this much padding, we make each LI this wide, we give it this dark purplish color with a border, removing the bullet point and aligning in the center, we get this result. Now if we apply a float left or a float right to this, if we add this property to the existing CSS properties, what will happen to the LIs is they will become stacked next to one another as opposed to under each other. So if we have a navigation, naturally LIs will go under each other because they are block elements. If we want them next to one another, we float them left or we float them right, so each LI goes right next to the one before it. And that's how we get a horizontal navigation.